Bullies locked the boy in a freezer. He was trained in a Siberian gulag and didn't feel the cold. Dmitry Volkov walked through the hallways of Jefferson High School like a ghost, his slight frame barely casting a shadow as students rushed past him without a second glance. At 17, he stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights, and dark circles under his eyes that made him look perpetually exhausted. His thick Russian accent made every word sound foreign and strange to his American classmates, and his second-hand clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, marking him as different from the moment he arrived. It had been 3 weeks since Dmitry and his grandmother had moved to this small town in Ohio, fleeing a past that no one at Jefferson High could possibly understand. His grandmother worked double shifts at the local diner, scraping together enough money to keep them afloat in their cramped apartment above the hardware store. Dmitry kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and tried to blend into the background of teenage life that seemed so alien to him. But blending in was impossible when you were the only kid in school who flinched at sudden noises, who ate every meal like it might be his last, and who carried himself with the careful, measured movements of someone who had learned early that drawing attention could mean pain. The first time Marcus Bradley noticed him, Dmitry was sitting alone in the far corner of the cafeteria, methodically eating his free lunch while reading a worn paperback book. Marcus was everything Dmitry wasn't: tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to worry about where your next meal would come from. He was the star linebacker on the football team, and his father owned the biggest car dealership in town. When Marcus decided someone was worth his attention, it was rarely a good thing. "Hey, Boris," Marcus called out, using the name he'd assigned to Dmitry on his first day. "You gonna finish that apple?" Dmitry looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting Marcus's for just a moment before dropping back to his book. He pushed the apple across the table without saying a word, hoping that would be the end of it. But Marcus wasn't interested in the apple. He was interested in the reaction, the way Dmitry's shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Marcus had grown up getting whatever he wanted, and what he wanted now was entertainment. "What's the matter, Boris? Cat got your tongue?" Marcus laughed, and his friends, Tyler Morrison and Jake Sullivan, joined in. Tyler was almost as big as Marcus, with the same cruel streak but less imagination. Jake was smaller, the kind of kid who tagged along with bullies because it was safer than being their target. Dmitry closed his book carefully, slipped it into his backpack, and stood to leave, but Marcus wasn't done with him yet. "Where you going, comrade? We're just getting to know each other." The way Marcus said comrade made it sound like a curse word. Other students were starting to notice now, turning in their seats to watch the show. Dmitry felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the old instincts kicking in. In another life, in another place, he would have already calculated the distance to the exits, identified potential weapons, assessed the threat level of each opponent. But this wasn't that place, and he wasn't that person anymore. At least, he was trying not to be. "I must go to class," Dmitry said quietly, his accent thick with tension. "Must go to class," Marcus mimicked, drawing out the vowels in an exaggerated Russian accent. "Must go to class, Comrade Boris." The laughter from the surrounding tables was like a physical blow. Dmitry's hand tightened on his backpack strap, and for just a moment his eyes flashed with something cold and dangerous. But he forced himself to turn away, to walk toward the cafeteria exit with measured steps. That's when Tyler stuck out his foot. Dmitry went down hard, his backpack spilling open as he hit the floor. Books scattered across the linoleum, and his worn notebook fell open, revealing pages covered in Cyrillic script. The laughter was louder now, and someone started clapping. "Oops," Tyler said, grinning down at him. "Sorry, Boris. Didn't see you there." Dmitry gathered his books in silence, his face burning with humiliation. As he reached for his notebook, Marcus stepped on it, grinding his heel into the pages. "What's this, Boris? Love letters to Putin?" The notebook was the only thing Dmitri had left from before, filled with his grandmother's recipes and stories from their homeland. Seeing it under Marcus's shoe sent a flash of rage through him so intense it made his vision blur. His fingers twitched, muscle memory trying to take over. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. His grandmother had made him promise. "Please," Dmitri whispered, looking up at Marcus. "Please give me my notebook." The please seemed to satisfy something in Marcus. He lifted his foot and stepped back, watching as Dmitri carefully picked up the damaged notebook and clutched it to his chest. "See you around, Boris," Marcus said, and there was a promise in his voice that made Dmitri's blood run cold. The pattern was established that day. Marcus and his friends would find Dmitri between classes, in the hallways, sometimes even in the bathroom. They would knock his books out of his hands, make comments about his accent, call him Boris or Comrade or Red. They would ask him if he missed his pet bear, if he knew how to make vodka, if he was a communist spy. Dmitri endured it all in silence. He would clean up whatever mess they made, pick up whatever they knocked down, and continue on his way without a word of complaint. He never fought back, never raised his voice, never even looked them in the eye for more than a second. The other students watched it happen with the kind of detached interest usually reserved for wildlife documentaries. Some of them felt bad for the quiet Russian kid, but not bad enough to get involved. Getting involved meant becoming a target, and everyone knew it was better to be a bystander than a victim. Mrs. Patterson, his English teacher, noticed the increasingly frequent bruises on his arms, the way he flinched when anyone raised their voice. She pulled him aside after class one day, her voice gentle with concern. "Dmitri, is everything all right at home? Are you having trouble adjusting to the school?" He looked at her with those pale, ancient eyes and nodded slowly. "Everything is fine, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for asking." She wanted to push, wanted to help, but there was something in his voice that warned her off. Something that suggested he had learned long ago that adults couldn't always be trusted to protect you. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October. Dmitri was walking to his locker after the final bell, looking forward to the weekend, to 2 days of blessed anonymity. But Marcus and his crew were waiting for him, and they had brought friends. "Hey, Boris!" Marcus called out, his voice echoing in the nearly empty hallway. "We were just talking about you." Dmitri stopped walking, but didn't turn around. He could hear them approaching, could count their footsteps, could smell the mixture of cologne and sweat that seemed to follow them everywhere. "We were wondering," Tyler said, moving to block Dmitri's path to the exit, "if it's true what they say about Russians and the cold." "Yeah," Jake chimed in, emboldened by the presence of the older boys. "I heard you guys are like immune to cold or something. Is that true, Boris?" Dmitri's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He tried to step around Tyler, but the bigger boy moved to block him again. "Come on, Boris," Marcus said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "We're just curious. You never talk to anyone, never tell us about yourself. We're trying to be friendly here." "I want to go home," Dmitri said quietly. "Home?" Marcus laughed. "You mean back to Russia?" "Yeah, we all want that too. But since you're stuck here with us Americans, you might as well answer our questions." The group had grown now, other students drawn by the promise of entertainment. Someone had their phone out, recording. Dmitri could see himself as they saw him, small, foreign, helpless. The familiar rage was building in his chest, but he pushed it down the way his grandmother had taught him. "Violence is not the answer, little wolf," she would say, using his childhood nickname. "Violence is what brought us here. Violence is what we left behind." But as Dmitri stood there, surrounded by teenagers who saw him as nothing more than a source of amusement, he could feel the little wolf stirring inside him. The part of him that had learned to survive in places where mercy was a luxury and weakness meant death. "I heard," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hallway, "that your dad was some kind of criminal. That's why you're here, right? Your family got kicked out of Russia?" The words hit Dmitri like physical blows. His father had been many things, but a criminal wasn't one of them. He had been a good man who had tried to stand up to the wrong people, tried to expose corruption that went all the way to the top. That's what had gotten him killed, and what had sent Dmitri and his grandmother fleeing across the ocean to this small Ohio town. "My father was a good man," Dmitri said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure he was," Marcus sneered. "That's why you're here instead of there, right? That's why you dress like a homeless person and your grandmother works at that greasy diner?" The circle of students was growing, and Dmitri could hear their whispers, their snickers. He could see some of them recording with their phones, capturing his humiliation for posterity. His hands were shaking now, and he clenched them into fists to hide it. "You know what?" Marcus said, his eyes lighting up with sudden inspiration. "I think it's time we tested that theory about Russians and the cold. What do you guys think?" The agreement was immediate and enthusiastic. Before Dmitri could react, strong hands grabbed his arms, and he found himself being dragged toward the back of the school. He didn't struggle, not yet. He knew that struggling would only make them more excited, more violent. They dragged him to the service area behind the cafeteria, where the big industrial freezer stood like a metal monolith. It was used for storing food deliveries, big enough to walk into, with a heavy door that sealed tight to keep the cold in. "Perfect," Marcus said, pulling out his phone to record. "Let's see just how tough our little Russian really is." Dmitri felt the old familiar calm settling over him as they forced him toward the freezer. It was the same calm he had felt in the camps when the guards would come for him in the middle of the night. The same calm he had felt when they would throw him into solitary confinement, into cells so cold that most men would break within hours. They didn't know. They couldn't know. To them, he was just a skinny 17-year-old kid who was too scared to fight back. They had no idea that he had spent 3 years in places that made their worst nightmares look like children's stories. "Please," he said, and his voice carried just the right note of fear. "Please don't do this." It was what they wanted to hear. Marcus's grin widened, and he gestured for Tyler and Jake to open the freezer door. The cold air rushed out in a visible cloud, and Dmitri could see the frost covering the metal shelves inside. "Don't worry, Boris," Marcus said, positioning his phone to get the best angle. "We'll let you out in a few minutes, just long enough to see if you're as tough as you pretend to be." They shoved him inside, and the heavy door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. Dmitri heard the click of the external lock, heard their laughter echoing through the metal walls, heard Marcus telling everyone to be quiet so they could hear him begging to be let out. Then there was silence. Dmitri stood in the darkness, breathing slowly and steadily. The temperature in the freezer was maybe 10 degrees below zero, cold enough to kill someone if they were trapped long enough, cold enough to cause frostbite and hypothermia in a matter of minutes. But Dmitri barely felt it. He had been in colder places, much colder. He had spent weeks in cells where the temperature dropped to 40 below, where the walls were covered in ice and every breath felt like swallowing knives. He had learned to slow his heart rate, to control his breathing, to generate heat through meditation techniques that most people had never heard of. Outside, he could hear Marcus and his friends waiting, probably expecting him to start pounding on the door within minutes, begging and pleading to be released. He could hear other students gathering, drawn by the excitement of seeing the weird Russian kid finally get what he deserved. But Dmitri didn't pound on the door. He didn't beg or plead. Instead, he found a comfortable position against the back wall and settled in to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Dmitri could hear confused voices outside now, people wondering why he wasn't making any noise. Marcus was getting impatient, his voice carrying clearly through the metal walls. "Why isn't he saying anything?" Tyler asked, and there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Maybe he passed out," Jake suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "Nobody passes out that fast," Marcus said, but Dmitri could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. 30 minutes. 40. The crowd outside was getting restless, and Dmitri could hear teachers' voices now, adults who had noticed the gathering and were asking questions. Someone was arguing about whether they should open the door, but Marcus was insisting that they wait just a little longer. At the 50-minute mark, Dmitri heard the sound he had been waiting for. The external lock clicking open. Light flooded the freezer as the door swung wide, and a dozen faces peered in, expecting to find a shivering, hypothermic teenager begging for mercy. Instead, they found Dmitri sitting calmly against the back wall, his breathing steady, his color normal. There was no frost on his clothes, no chattering teeth, no signs of distress at all. He looked up at them with those pale blue eyes and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "In Siberia, we call this summer weather." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Marcus stumbled backward, his face going pale. The other students began whispering among themselves, phones appearing to capture this impossible moment. Tyler and Jake looked like they had seen a ghost. Dmitri stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust off his clothes. As he walked toward the door, the crowd parted before him like he was carrying some kind of disease, but he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "Marcus," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that made everyone freeze. "You wanted to know about my father, about why we came to America." Marcus couldn't seem to find his voice. He just stood there, staring at Dmitri like he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. "My father," Dmitri continued, stepping closer, "was a journalist. He wrote stories about men who thought they were powerful, men who thought they could hurt people without consequences. The men he wrote about didn't like that very much." Another step closer. Marcus tried to back away, but there were too many people behind him. "They killed him," Dmitri said, his voice still conversational. "But first, they wanted to send a message. So they took his 13-year-old son, that would be me, and they put him in a place where little boys go to die. They wanted to break me, to make me an example of what happens when you stand up to the wrong people." The silence was absolute now. Even the teachers who had arrived to break up the gathering had stopped talking, drawn in by the quiet intensity of Dmitri's voice. "For 3 years," Dmitri continued, "I lived in places that would give you nightmares. I learned things that no child should have to learn. I survived things that would break most grown men. And do you know what kept me alive, Marcus?" Marcus shook his head, unable to speak. "The knowledge that someday, somewhere there would be people like you, people who think that strength comes from hurting those who can't fight back, people who think that power means making others suffer." Dmitri was close enough to touch Marcus now, close enough that everyone could see the difference between them. Marcus was bigger, stronger, supposedly tougher. But in that moment, he looked like a child compared to the pale, slight boy standing in front of him. "You want to see what I learned in those camps, Marcus?" Dmitri asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want to find out what happens when you push someone who has nothing left to lose?" For a moment, it looked like Marcus might say yes. His pride was warring with his growing fear, and Dmitri could see the exact moment when fear won. I'm sorry," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking. It was just a joke, man. We didn't mean anything by it." Dmitri studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know you didn't mean anything by it. That's the problem. You hurt people because you're bored, because it makes you feel important because you can. That's what makes you dangerous, Marcus. Not your size, not your friends, not your father's money. Your indifference to other people's pain." He turned to address the entire crowd now, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. I came here to start over, to leave the violence behind. My grandmother made me promise to be better than the people who hurt my family. For 3 weeks, I've kept that promise. I've let you mock me, humiliate me, hurt me, because I thought that was what being better meant. His pale eyes swept across the faces of his classmates, and several of them looked away. But I was wrong. Being better doesn't mean being weak. It doesn't mean letting bullies do whatever they want, because fighting back might make you just like them. Sometimes being better means standing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Dimitri took a step back, giving Marcus some breathing room, but his eyes never left the bigger boy's face. You have a choice to make, Marcus. All of you do. You can keep being the kind of people who hurt others for entertainment, or you can choose to be better. But understand this. I'm done being your victim. I'm done being anyone's victim. The crowd was starting to disperse now, teachers moving in to restore order, students drifting away in small groups, whispering among themselves. But Marcus remained frozen in place, staring at Dimitri like he was seeing him for the first time. "What are you?" Marcus whispered. Dimitri considered the question seriously. "I'm someone who survived hell so I could have a chance at a normal life. I'm someone who lost everything and came here hoping to find something better. I'm someone who's been pushed as far as he can be pushed." He paused, then added, "But mostly I'm just a 17-year-old kid who wants to be left alone." As Dimitri walked away, heading toward the front of the school where his grandmother would be waiting to pick him up, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on his back. But it felt different now. Where before there had been dismissal and contempt, now there was something else. Respect, maybe, or fear. He wasn't sure which one he preferred. The next Monday, Jefferson High School was a different place for Dmitry Volkov. Students who had never spoken to him before nodded when they passed him in the halls. Teachers looked at him with new interest, as if they were seeing him clearly for the first time. And Marcus Bradley, the terror of the junior class, went out of his way to avoid eye contact. The story of what had happened in the freezer had spread over the weekend, growing in the telling. Some versions had Dmitry meditating like a monk, others had him doing push-ups in the sub-zero temperatures. A few claimed he had been humming Russian folk songs the entire time. Dmitry didn't bother to correct any of the stories, let them think what they wanted to think. The important thing was that nobody was calling him Boris anymore. At lunch, he sat in his usual corner, reading his book and eating his free meal. But this time, when someone approached his table, it wasn't Marcus or his crew. It was Sarah Chen, a quiet girl from his chemistry class who had always seemed as invisible as he had been. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Dmitry looked up, surprised. "Of course. Please." As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the cafeteria, noting the way conversations died down whenever people looked in their direction. "So," she said casually, opening her own lunch bag. "Siberia, huh?" Dmitry's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Actually, it was more like Ukraine, but close enough." "Ukraine," she repeated thoughtfully. "I've heard it's beautiful there." "Parts of it are," Dmitry agreed. "The parts that aren't covered in concrete and razor wire." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, two invisible kids who had suddenly become very visible indeed. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "You know, I always thought you seemed sad," she said. "Not scared, not angry, just sad." Dmitry considered this. "I suppose I was. It's hard to leave everything behind and start over, especially when the things you left behind weren't your choice." "But you're not just sad, are you?" Sarah continued. "There's something else, something that Marcus and his friends never saw." "What do you think it is?" Dmitri asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Sarah took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. Strength, I guess. Not the kind that comes from muscles or attitude, but the kind that comes from surviving things that would break other people. The kind that lets you sit in a freezer for almost an hour without flinching. You think that makes me strong? Dmitri asked. I think, Sarah said carefully, that you're the strongest person in this school. Maybe the strongest person I've ever met. And I think you're also the loneliest. The observation hit Dmitri harder than he expected. He had been so focused on keeping his head down, on avoiding trouble, that he hadn't realized how isolated he had become. Even before the incident with Marcus, he had been drifting through his days like a ghost, barely connecting with anyone or anything. Perhaps, he admitted, but I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once, Sarah suggested. Maybe you can start with just being yourself, the real you, not the version you think people want to see. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared at the edge of their table. But this wasn't the swaggering, confident bully who had tormented Dmitri for weeks. This was a different Marcus, one who looked smaller somehow, less sure of himself. Dmitri, he said, his voice quiet enough that only they could hear him. Can I talk to you? Dmitri looked up at him, noting the way Marcus's hands shook slightly, the way he kept glancing around as if afraid someone might be watching. Of course, Dmitri said, gesturing to an empty chair. Marcus sat down carefully, like he was expecting the chair to collapse under him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Marcus cleared his throat. I want to apologize, he said, the words coming out in a rush. Not just for Friday, but for everything. The names, the pushing, all of it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Dmitri studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of deception or insincerity. But all he saw was a 17-year-old boy who looked as lost and confused as Dmitri felt most days. Why? Dmitri asked simply. Why what? Why did you do it? Why did you decide I was worth tormenting? Marcus looked down at his hands, struggling to find the words. I don't know. Because I could, I guess. Because you were different, and different was easy to pick on. Because it made me feel powerful. And now I can't stop thinking about what you said, about your father, about the camps, about what kind of person I am. Marcus looked up, meeting Dmitri's eyes. I don't want to be that person anymore. Dmitri nodded slowly. That's a start. I know an apology doesn't fix anything, Marcus continued. I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to try to make it right somehow. How? Marcus was quiet for a moment, then straightened up with visible effort. I want to tell everyone the truth. About what really happened on Friday, about what I did to you, about what kind of person you really are. And what kind of person am I? Dmitri asked, genuinely curious. Someone who's been through hell and came out the other side without losing his soul, Marcus said. Someone who could have destroyed me on Friday but chose not to. Someone who's stronger than all of us put together but doesn't use that strength to hurt people. The sincerity in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, and Dmitri felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, exactly. That would take time, but the beginning of understanding. I accept your apology, Dmitri said finally, but understand that it will take time for trust to grow between us. I understand, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. Thank you for not doing to me what I deserved. As Marcus stood to leave, he paused and looked back at Dmitri. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you're here. I think this place needs someone like you. After he was gone, Sarah looked at Dmitri with newfound respect. That was impressive, she said. Most people in your position would have wanted revenge. Revenge is easy, Dmitri replied, thinking of his grandmother's words. Forgiveness is hard, but building something better is harder still. The weeks that followed brought changes that Dmitri hadn't expected. Marcus, true to his word, began actively working to undo the damage he had done. He stopped his friends from harassing other students, stood up to bullies in the hallways, and even started volunteering with the peer counseling program. Tyler and Jake, deprived of their leader's encouragement, found their taste for bullying had diminished considerably. They kept their distance from Dmitri, but they also stopped targeting other vulnerable students. As for Dmitri himself, he found that standing up for himself had opened doors he hadn't known existed. Students who had ignored him before began including him in conversations, inviting him to study groups, asking for his help with subjects he excelled in. He discovered that Sarah wasn't the only one who had been watching him from the sidelines. There were other quiet students, other outsiders who had recognized something in him long before the incident in the freezer. They formed a loose group of friends who met in the library during lunch, discussing books and current events and the kinds of deep questions that most teenagers avoided. Mrs. Patterson, his English teacher, pulled him aside after class one day with an opportunity that surprised him. "Dmitri," she said, "I've been thinking about what happened a few weeks ago, and I have a proposal for you." "Yes, ma'am?" "I run a program for at-risk students, kids who are struggling with bullying, family problems, that sort of thing. I think you could be a real asset to the program. Your perspective, your experiences could help other students who are going through difficult times." Dmitri considered this carefully. "What would I have to do?" "Just talk to them. Share your story, if you're comfortable doing that. Show them that it's possible to survive terrible things and still become someone good." The idea was both terrifying and appealing. Dmitri had spent so long hiding from his past, trying to pretend it didn't exist, that the thought of deliberately sharing it felt like stepping off a cliff. But maybe that was exactly what he needed to do. "I'll think about it," he told Mrs. Patterson. That evening, as he walked home from school, Dmitri found himself taking a different route through the downtown area. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the promise of winter. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the commotion ahead of him. A group of older teenagers, maybe college age, had cornered a younger kid against the wall of the hardware store. Dmitri could hear their laughter, could see the fear in the younger boy's eyes, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest. For a moment, he hesitated. This wasn't his problem. He had done his part, had stood up for himself, had earned his place at school. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, continue on his path toward a normal life. But as he watched the older boys closing in on their victim, he heard his grandmother's voice in his head, not warning him away from violence this time, but reminding him of something else she had taught him. "The wolf protects the pack, little one. That is what makes him more than just another predator." Dmitri took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hey!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Leave him alone." The older boys turned toward him, sizing him up. They saw what everyone saw, a slight, pale teenager who looked like he could be knocked over by a strong wind. "Mind your own business, kid," the largest one said, turning back to his victim. "This is my business," Dmitri replied, moving closer. "Let him go." Something in his voice made them pause. It was the same quality that had frozen Marcus and his friends in place, the sound of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You want to take his place?" one of them sneered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Dmitri smiled, and it was the same cold smile he had worn in the freezer. "If that's what it takes." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, without quite understanding why, the older boys began backing away. They muttered threats and curses, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. Something about the pale, quiet teenager had unsettled them in a way they couldn't explain. After they were gone, Dmitri helped the younger boy to his feet. The kid couldn't have been more than 14, with the kind of frightened, desperate look that Dmitri recognized all too well. "Thank you," the boy whispered. "What's your name?" Dmitri asked. "Tommy. Tommy Walsh." "Well, Tommy Walsh, let me tell you something about bullies. They're like wolves, but not the good kind. They hunt in packs, they pick on the weak, and they run when someone stands up to them." Tommy nodded, still shaking slightly. "But here's the thing," Dmitri continued. "You don't have to be a victim. You don't have to let them define who you are. You can choose to be stronger than they are, not by fighting, but by refusing to let them break you." As Dmitri walked away, leaving Tommy standing in the gathering dusk, he realized that Mrs. Patterson had been right. His experiences, terrible as they were, had given him something valuable: the ability to recognize suffering in others and the knowledge of how to survive it. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start using it to build something better. The next day, he found Mrs. Patterson after class and told her he was ready to join the peer counseling program. It was time to stop being the victim of his story and start becoming the hero of someone else's. Standing in the hallway of Jefferson High School, surrounded by the normal chaos of teenage life, Dmitri Volkov finally understood what his grandmother had been trying to teach him all along. Strength wasn't about enduring suffering in silence. It wasn't about hiding from your past or pretending to be someone you weren't. Real strength was about taking the worst things that had happened to you and using them to make sure they didn't happen to someone else. It was about standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone who couldn't stand up for themselves. He was no longer the ghost in the hallway, the invisible boy that everyone ignored. He wasn't Boris the victim or the mysterious Russian with the dangerous past. He was Dmitri Volkov, survivor and protector, ready to face whatever came next, with the kind of courage that could only come from having already survived the worst and chosen to remain human despite it all.